Hey, welcome back. I haven't done one of these since a month ago. Well, more than a month ago. Usually we do these like at the beginning of the month once we get the first GHB or Tempest trial, but engage. So I had it put to the wayside, but at least now we're getting it out. Today, I'm going to be updating my list on who I think are probably the most worthwhile Grail units that you could build up right now. And by no means is this definitive. I always recommend hearing from multiple sources because everybody gives usually a different perspective on what does and doesn't work. So it's better for more of an insight, especially if you don't have any sensible direction with what you want to do with your Grails. But yeah, we're just going to be updating the list, going over some notable changes, some units I do think are a lot better, some that are maybe a bit worse, and just giving an overall final ranking on what I believe you should probably invest into at this current time. And before we continue, I do want to bring mention of today's sponsor that is going to play right now.
We don't have any plans at the moment to do PC. Do you guys not have phones?
Yeah, you guys all have phones, right?
Well, I sure do. And what a good time to have one thanks to today's sponsor, Austin Remote. Austin Remote allows you to control your PC and play PC games remotely from your own mobile device. Remote Desktop is a fast, stable, and reliable way to remotely access your PC through something like a phone, a tablet, or another PC, and this can be used to control or troubleshoot the computers in question through your device. It's available on Windows, iOS, and Android, and it's free. Actually, well, there is one barrier of entry. You gotta have a phone. That being said, the program is free, and the coolest part about it is that it works both ways, as in you can either play mobile games on your PC or play PC games on your phone. It's rather flexible in that regard and makes it much more vastly appealing. They also have paid options if you do want to shell out a few bucks for additional features. The benefit to paying a bit of money for the extended program is that you can get stuff like remote control for Android devices, and you can enjoy more stable and faster connections in general. Likewise, there's a smart power plug which you can actually get as an extension for the program, so you don't necessarily need to keep your computer on all the time. You can still do remote access through your phone as a result of it. Just one tap to wake it up, one tap to shut it down, and put it on your phone and you're good to go. However, if you would rather try it out first, they have the free option, so you may as well give it a shot. Thanks to Austin Remote for sponsoring the video. Before we go right into the video, I do want to preface a couple things. The video is going to be divided into 3 tier lists, one for Aether raids, one for Summoner Duels, and one for Arena. And based on each placement of each individual unit, there's going to be a cumulative rank at the end of the video. And if you are looking for a specific unit for specific purposes, then you could just take any individual list into account, especially if you aren't interested in some modes over others. Otherwise, if you have any other questions or you want to leave feedback, just leave them in the comments and I'll get to them as soon as I can. But yeah, with that out of the way, we may as well get right into the Aether raids tier list. On the last video, I do remember promoting a lot of axes because of their arcane downfall accessibility, but now that we have the new arcane lance, which also provides breath per hit, slaying, and all sorts of other stuff, it can fulfill a similar niche to that of arcane downfall. The only difference being is that the lance provides a guaranteed follow-up, whereas the axe provides healing per hit. So in terms of general performance, both weapons have their own dedicated niche. In my opinion, the lance definitely functions a lot better in the player phase for Gale Force purposes because the axe does heal you and will more than likely prevent you from entering the Wings of Mercy range. However, when it comes to general tanking, having some form of sustainability is always a great thing, especially if you were to pair it up with something like Finish, where you could get a really high amount of healing per hit, which does make your general survivability really good, especially for those who can speed sack, where you can take advantage of damage reduction skills, at which point you're basically taking almost no damage. Although, there are always going to be circumstances where that's not necessarily possible. Beyond that, there are a couple of new additions that are probably worth highlighting some over others, such as healer specials, now meaning that healers can actually deal damage with a special, which is really nice. Although, given a lot of the Grail units that we do have, a lot of them really aren't going to be taking advantage of it as much as others, but that's to be expected when a lot of them are pretty much generic with not really anything of notable quality. And other than that, we had some additional beast skills, including beast follow, which does help out with a few amount of beasts in particular, although it may not necessarily reflect in the Aether raids tier list itself. But kicking us off in the highest tier, we have 2 new promotions in Fallen Dalthea and Bridal Larum. Initially, when Fallen Delthea got her refined, it was still really good as is. It gave Spectrum 9, it gave a lot of additional attack and speed, and nullified any bonuses to the foe's speed and res, meaning that doubling was going to be a lot more reliable for her over a lot of other units, especially since you couldn't get it through visible buffs. And now with the addition of stuff like Emblem, they can't get external support, so they're basically going to be relying on visible stats, and more likely than not, it's not going to matter in the grand scheme of things, especially when it comes to a dark defense team, as more often than not, Delthea's probably not going to struggle to double in a lot of the sense of the word. Although there are always going to be exceptions, for the most part, she probably won't be struggling on that front whatsoever, and because of her infantry status and a lot of other additional skills such as infantry speed tactic and infantry null follow, she doesn't have to necessarily give up her sacred seal or B slot for null follow, meaning that she could continually stack up her attack and speed, at which point her damage output just becomes ridiculously strong, and she doesn't necessarily have to worry about getting one shot in the player phase because now she could get damage reduction from her A slot. So combine that with times+4 and special spiral 4, she can hit really hard and bypass through effects that would otherwise cut down on her damage output. And in my opinion, because of these additional skills and a lot of the other things she can access thanks to external support, I find that her performance is going to be a lot better overall nowadays than it was maybe a month or two ago. Meanwhile, with Bridal Alarm, it's really going to boil down to the new Arcane, making her a fantastic hybrid Gale Force combat unit. This was always something that I found to be really good, especially on a turn 1 Gale Force setting, where the whole idea is to neutralize as many foes as possible and make it so you could get the pots with relative ease, while simultaneously disarming the foe and making sure that you aren't putting yourself in any danger. And now with the Arcane Lance, Larm can provide good Aetherite's offense utility thanks to her ability to not only dance, but also attack in combat. And her offenses aren't even necessarily bad either, 57, 53 at max investment, although that always will depend on the unit you use too. For what it's worth, I don't think she's really going to be struggling to double whatsoever, nor do I think she's really going to struggle to get damage out. And because of this, I do think as a Gale Force Dancer utility unit, she's definitely one of the better ones that we have in the game now. And for that, I do think it's worth promoting her. And in a similar vein to other Arcane users, I ultimately decided that it might be better to promote a lot of the armors up into solid, not necessarily because they function better in an Aetherite's offense setting, but because by just evaluating them through an Aetherite's offense lens, it does limit their potential, and it doesn't necessarily paint the most accurate picture in what they're capable of. And for that reason, I ended up promoting basically almost every armor, if not every single notable armor, into the solid category, especially since they all have access to the Arcane Sword, Lance, and Axe, meaning that their general savior performance is going to be really solid overall. The Sword because it does provide guard and can hinder a lot of stuff like Gale Force strategies or just general damage output. The Lance because it has a breath and guaranteed follow-up, meaning that if you did also want to counter attack, you do have the ease of doing it, although if the foe has any sort of no follow-up effect, then it may not necessarily matter in the end. But regardless, with the guaranteed follow-up and follow-up prevention as well as breath, they aren't necessarily a sitting duck. That being said, if you don't necessarily want to take the risk of just countering back, you could always just go back with the Arcane Downfall, which also provides a relatively good niche as is. The only thing it is missing comparatively to the Lance is the guaranteed follow-up, and while it does trade it for healing, I don't necessarily think either effect is really going to matter, especially if you don't plan to counterattack anyway. Those effects will basically become minute, and at that point you may as well either stack up something that has a guard effect, or you can run something like Savalin and act as a way better tank overall. And because of that, I did end up promoting a majority of these units. The only one I did end up demoting from Superb was Naysala, because before Arcane Lance, we did have Downfall, which could have provided a similar niche to Naysala, but the big hindrance was the healing, meaning that any sort of Gale Force strategy that relied on Wings of Mercy beaconing was going to be a lot more difficult comparatively to something like Naysala, who has Flashing Blade with half no follow-up, meaning that he could easily just go into the Wings of Mercy range with no issue whatsoever. However, now that we have the Arcane Lance, I find that his niche isn't necessarily as unique. In fact, it's a lot more saturated in general, which is why I did push him down to solid, and I did end up promoting Summer Norn to solid because I do think she could also fulfill a similar niche with relatively no issue whatsoever, and general trade-offs that you could easily argue between the two as to whether or not one is better over the other. For example, Norn can access stuff like tempo and velocity, meaning that she will always be able to secure her own Gale Force, whereas Naysala could potentially fumble the bag if the foe does have any sort of guard effect. However, with the Flying Beast benefits, he does have 3 movement right off the bat and can access range, meaning that his general damage output and doubling potential is going to be a lot more secure comparatively. However, I don't find that they should necessarily be in a tier difference. And then as for the other two additions, Ludwig is a generic armor, but he does follow a similar suit to a lot of the other armors in the game, which is why he's going to be in the same tier as all the other armors. And Lumera is a very fantastic stat stick. She does get a lot of stats from her weapon, including true damage and damage reduction, and her general tanking prowess is going to be really good because she is one of the fastest units that we have in the game. However, when it comes to anything like Gale Force or Godlike Reflexes or anything of the sort, she's not necessarily going to be as good as Rutger in my opinion, because Rutger does have slaying, breath per hit, and generally better offenses, which is why I do think he is a bit better, especially since he has a lot more flexibility in what he can do both in the player phase and in the enemy phase. But for what it's worth, I still think Lumera is a really good unit, and for that reason I am willing to put her in the solid tier. Beyond that, there are also other general changes, including a lot of promotions for General Lance Cavalry, who are fast, the placement of Valentine's Effie, who is pretty much just a generic infantry axe, but will follow a similar suit to a lot of the other infantry axes, and a fair amount of demotions of infantry axes in general, because now that we have the Arcane Lance, I find that their Gale Force niche isn't going to be necessarily as strong. Moreover, because I do find that late season is heavily volatile against most enemy phase strategies, unless you're named Brave Dimitri, Asker, Lucia, etc., I find that their performance comparatively to a lot of other units in higher tiers aren't necessarily going to be a lot better. And for that reason, I did push them down to decent. They could still work in a lot of aspects, especially with Godlike Reflexes builds, but for the most part, I don't necessarily think they're going to be performing on the same level as a lot of the other units above them. And I do want to briefly mention Sigrun before we move on to the other tiers. She did recently get a refund in the form of Command Lance, which grants first hit flat 40% damage reduction, a potential Spectrum 15 or Spectrum 14, I forget which one, but it was around that ballpark, and it does restore 7 HP after every combat. And with the addition of something like Pegasus Flight 4 that we did recently get from Chloe, I do think for what it's worth, she can act as a relatively okay enemy phase unit. Granted, being a flyer isn't necessarily the best when it comes to enemy phase stuff, unless, well, you are built for enemy phase purposes. However, in Sigrun's case, I don't think she's necessarily going to be as crazy as maybe something like an Arcane Downfall with Finish and Bulwark and all that stuff, because she is locked out of a fair amount of skills. However, for what it's worth, I do think her weapon can work in a lot of retrospects in the enemy phase. In worst case scenario, if you did want to use the Arcane, well, she's going to be performing as well as a lot of the other generics at that point. And as for Death Knight, well, we have the Arcane, which is basically his weapon, but better. I don't know what you were doing, IS. And beyond that, it's really just more arcane shifting and new inheritable options given to a lot of other units, meaning that they can function on a better level than they were before, but I don't think they're necessarily going to be as good as a lot of the other units above them. I did move down a few units just for general shifts in their performance, especially now that units are getting way more hyper offensive or defensive. It's not really going to be cutting it as much comparatively. Likewise with the ranged armors, I find that you're not really going to be performing on the level that you really need to be performing on, especially nowadays, as Hardy Fighter really is important for a lot of these tanks in general, since there's so many effects that can either bypass through damage reduction or units just hitting really hard in general, and that just continues to go up and up and up, while ranged armors in particular just don't necessarily keep going anywhere, which is why I did push down a fair amount of them. Maybe with the Arcanes in the future, it'll help out their enemy phase prowess, but for now, I don't think they're really going to be as adequate as a lot of the other units in Decent. Other than that, I pretty much shifted accordingly. Arcanes going up. I find that the slower Lance Cavs aren't going to be on the same level as a lot of the other fast ones, because in cases of Hardy Fighter and Fallout Prevention, you're going to be relying on speed, and if they don't have the speed to compete for it, then it's not going to matter in the end. Although they could still act relatively well with Wings of Mercy, however, I don't think I'd put them in the same category, but that's wholly debatable one way or the other. I moved up the infantry healers because now with Light's Restraint and, well, not Holy Pressure, because Holy Pressure really isn't good outside of Elise, and Times Pulse 4, I find that they can actually perform relatively well as general damage dealers, especially on the Catria Ball, because they can bypass stuff like Deflect Magic since it doesn't cover staves. At which point I do think they could fulfill their own similar niche, however, not having access to a lot of other stuff on top of just being not necessarily the most offensive in general. I'm not entirely sure if they should be above can work or not, but regardless, there are a lot of other means that could bypass through damage reduction in general, so maybe that could be wholly debated too. And otherwise, it's female Robin who got access to Grandier, which does help out a lot more with their defensive properties, especially if you are going to be acting in an Aether Raid's offense setting. And otherwise, that's pretty much all the changes when it comes to Aether Raids. Next, we're going to go into the Summoner Duels category. Summoner Duels is definitely going to be a bit more volatile comparatively to something like Aether Raids because there's always constant captain skill changes and map rotations throughout pretty much every 2-3 weeks. I forget which number exactly, but it's enough to the point where it's not as consistent as something like Aether Raids where you know where you can prepare for certain stuff, whereas in Summoner Duels you definitely have to play around the captain skills and map generally every rotation. That being said, there is one key difference between Aether Raids and Summoner Duels is that in Summoner Duels what you have is what you get, whereas in Aether Raids there's so many skills and mechanics that they can take advantage of, and they have access up to 5 teams, meaning that they can pretty much prepare for anything necessary if they have the resources to do it. However, that being said, I do think you could find some semblance of consistent performance when it comes to a lot of these units in general, and that's mainly because, again, what you see with them is what you're going to get. Stat-wise, you're pretty much going to be going up against players, so it's not going to be as easy to use something comparatively there as it would be in Aether Raids. Regardless, we might as well just get right into the list. Similarly to the previous list, I did promote the armors to solid thanks to the addition of the arcane lance, which does allow them to function really well as a general save unit if the opportunity arises. Otherwise, there is pretty much just general performance shifts. I find that Black Knight's performance isn't necessarily going to be as clear-cut nowadays because he did rely on Savvy Fighter or a lot of other stuff to just generally stand out. However, I find that Black Luna isn't necessarily enough for something like Summoner Duels nowadays because there's a fair amount of damage reduction to the point where you could easily soak Black Luna if necessary, and while you could potentially use something like Special Spiral 4, you do lose out on any semblance of damage reduction, at which point he's more than likely going to get one shot by pretty much anything. You could always get away with this in Aether Raids where there's just an increased amount of HP inflation as well as general stats allocated to units that are blessed. However, in Summoner Duels, it's just legendary bonuses and whatever potential support that you can fit into your slots, but if you're able to do that, then your opponent's going to be able to do that as well, which is why I do think pushing him down to solid is more than fair. However, I did keep Zephyr in Superb because I find out of the 3 sword armors that he generally has the best stat line to work with when it comes to far save purposes, which is still currently a lot more prominent than near save. Arden does have a fair amount of HP, but that can only go so far for just patching up your horrible res, whereas Zephyr, while doesn't have necessarily as much HP as Arden, does have a fair amount of res over him, at which point his magical bulk is just going to be significantly better in the long term, which is why I do have them a tier separate. Otherwise, I did promote Kanas for similar reasons. He does have access to remote skills now. He has Time Source 4, Special Spiral 4. There are so many more mechanics that can allow him to perform at a really adequate level to the point where he can actually be a really threatening offensive unit. And again, similarly with Ludwig and Lumera, they're going to be fulfilling a similar niche here too. Lumera, she could pretty much just stack up more damage reduction, and if there are certain instances where you could use stuff like Might of Myriad, she could always use Finish instead of a distant counter skill, at which point I do think she could perform really adequately in something like Summoner Duels, since more often than not it's going to be boiling down to more of your base stats than whatever you could potentially conjure as support, because the players can pretty much mimic the same thing. Other than that, there's still more Arcane Lance promotions as well as the Command Lance Refine. I find that this is going to be performing a lot better in Summoner Duels than it would be in Aether Raids, mainly because it's easier to play around such threats, whereas in Aether Raids you could easily just get dogpiled by a fair amount of units per enemy phase. In Summoner Duels, the player phase and enemy phase stuff works differently, as it is rotated by action, meaning that it is way easier to play around Sigrun's weaknesses comparatively. And she does get a fair amount of stats from her weapon, alongside healing and damage reduction, meaning that if she is able to outspeed and not get doubled, then it is possible for her to become a fairly annoying unit to deal with. Otherwise, it's just more general performance shifts to match other similar units that weren't in the same tier prior, as well as Summoner Norn, who can also do godlike reflexes stuff now thanks to the Arcane Lance, and Valentine's Effie, who's going to be following a similar suit to all the other infantry axes. And outside of that, there's just more general performance shifts, again thanks to the Arcane Lance and new inheritables. The healers again do see a significant boost, but that's mainly from the infantry ones, because now they have a bit more offensive pressure thanks to Light's Restraint, which is really significant, since they could again bypass stuff like Deflect Magic without any worry whatsoever, which is really good. On top of the fact that Light's Restraint, or if you want to use Holy Pressure, do have additional effects which can allow them to provide even more utility to the team, at which point I do think they can work. And other than that, there's just a demotion of the AoE Shadows of Valentia Lance niche, which I did have up and decent for a long while thanks to the fact that we did have Sonya in its curtains, meaning that it was possible to cripple the entire team by just spamming a giant AoE, which is is really convenient, especially with cavalry movement. However, it is a bit more replicable due to the arcane, not only in part due to the arcane meaning that they aren't going to be losing out on as many stats, and they could always recharge it depending on the team composition, but because charging specials isn't going to be nearly as much of an issue nowadays, since there are a lot more units that can fulfill that similar niche that Sonya does have with her quick impulse 2 effect. I find that the general niche isn't nearly as compelling or as unique nowadays, and because of that, I did move a lot of them down. Also, I forgot, Beast follow-up, you could use that on New Year Keaton, and while he isn't necessarily the best unit, even with the new Beast follow-up, since no follow-up is pretty much everywhere nowadays, I think for what it's worth, unless you run into a dragon, he could act as a really solid front-lining wall, and you could always have Farsight parked in the back, and I guess that can work too, but that will also be map dependent, because if there's too much open space, then it's not really going to be as compelling. But again, because of shifting captain skills all the time and map rotation, it's a lot more difficult to evaluate comparatively. And that's all there is when it comes to the Summoner Duels tier list. Beyond that, it's really just Arena, and that's going to be boiling down to whatever BST they come with. And surprise, surprise, the armor scores well. The infantry unit with a PRF also scores well, and the infantry unit without a PRF also scores well, because in Modern FE, everyone has a gajillion BST. And there really isn't much to talk about on this front. The most that I could really show on it is just general comparisons across the board. So with Ludwig and Lumera, you could see that they pretty much scored the same as a lot of the other units in Superb. So Cervantes, Hans, Mordecai, Holst, they all score the same. For that reason, they're pretty much going to be in the same tier. And for Effie, while she does lack a PRF, she still scores significantly better than a lot of the other units in Decent, because her BSC is just way too high. And because of that, I did put her in the solid tier. And that's all it's really going to boil down to when it comes to the arena. And before we get to the final tally, I do want to at least mention again that depending on what you're looking for in a unit, 1 or 2 of these lists may not even matter to you. If you're looking for something purely for Aether raids, go at it. If it's something for arena, there you go. But the reason I have these 3 lists in mind is because if you do plan on building a merge project, Grails don't come very fast at all. And if you do plan to build up somebody with the idea of just having them useful for a fair amount of time in the game, then you may want to consider all aspects. However, if you do want to use it for specific modes, then it's really not going to matter. So yeah, just take that into account as we go into the final ranking, which has the following units. Based on the cumulative total across the 3 tier lists, I found that Cervantes, Lumera, and Ludwig are probably going to be the most valuable Grails that you can invest into at this time. Cervantes and Ludwig, mainly because their armors, they score well, they can act as savior units, and they have access to arcanes. They're pretty much just cheat units at this point, but in terms of longevity, I don't really know how far they're going to go, mainly because they are generics at the end of the day. Meanwhile, with Lumera, you could always argue a similar thing, because she is in a similar situation where she is a god sword, and those will eventually get crept anyway. But in terms of general performance and scoring, I find that she's probably way more adequate than a lot of the other units. She may not necessarily be better than other sword units comparatively in other game modes, but for what it's worth, she is going to be providing a fair amount of utility across pretty much every single game mode ever. So if you did want to build any unit in particular, I find that these 3 are probably going to be your best bet. Although, in my opinion, Lumera might take you further just because she does have a PRF to work with. But yeah, those are pretty much just my takes. I hope that this video provided some sort of help. Let me know what your thoughts are down below. Do you use other units in particular for certain game modes? How does it fare for you? And if you have any other feedback, questions, suggestions, whatever, let me know down below. And if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.